October 1962. The United States Strategic Air Command moves the American military to Defense Condition 2, one step away from nuclear war.
Each one of those bombers had a target.
In the U.S. and Moscow, accusations and denials.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over.
U.S. invasion forces are poised for a massive attack, while at sea, in the air, and on land, nuclear weapons are in the hands of captains and majors.
If called upon to use a weapon, we would have fulfilled our orders.
We're going to throw the Soviets out of there and, teach them this is our hemisphere. And we're going to do away with Castro once and for all.
The attention of the world is on the island nation of Cuba, where men, women, and children are mobilized to defend against imminent invasion. In the White House and the Kremlin, lack of sleep, lack of communication.
The question that was raised, who's in charge in the Soviet Union? That's when things really get dangerous.
At stake is the fate of the entire world. There is little doubt that this war, if it comes, will be nuclear.
There was panic. There's no two ways about it. People thought that this was a real thing.
I told my wife, I will not go to work today. I don't know what will be tomorrow. It's quite possible that tomorrow we will not be alive.
DEFCON 2, the highest state of U.S. military readiness short of nuclear war.
I'm Tom Clancy. Most of you know me as a writer of fiction involving nuclear weapons and superpower confrontation. But for a few tense weeks in October 1962, it wasn't fiction at all. It was reality. In Washington, Moscow, Havana, and on the high seas. We've always known that the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer than it has ever been to nuclear war. But much of what really went on behind the scenes has been kept top secret until only very recently. Now, 40 years later, those who are on the front lines of the crisis, missile commanders, submarine captains, and undercover spies, now tell us that we were even closer to nuclear war than almost anyone thought. That nuclear launch capability on both sides depended upon the reliability of mid-rank officers, men who would not hesitate to fire those devastating weapons if ordered to do so. Worse yet, a global nuclear war could very easily have started by accident. It was touch and go for days when, for the first time in history, the United States went to DEFCON 2. I'm Tom Clancy, and this is DEFCON 2.
It's the height of the Cold War, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Premier Nikita Khrushchev, is contemplating his next critical move. He takes a walk with his defense minister, Marshal Malinovsky, on the shores of the Black Sea.
When the days are clear, you can see across the Black Sea the lines of the Turkish shore. And Malinovsky and Khrushchev, walking alongside, were discussing, and then suddenly Malinovsky said, "Well, Nikita, look there. It's Turkey. There are American missiles." And Khrushchev reacted, "We must think about it and do something."
Khrushchev can see more than Jupiter missiles in Turkey. He can see the Soviet Union's entire strategic position in mid-1962, and he does not like what he sees. He sees the U.S. and its NATO allies surrounding him with nuclear weapons. 15 Jupiter missiles being installed in Turkey, 30 more in Italy, 60 Thor missiles in Britain. But most threatening of all, he sees nearly 1,600 American strategic bombers and 200 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can strike the Soviet Union from the U.S. In the Cold War balance, the Soviets have a significant disadvantage. General Anatoly Gribkov served on the Red Army General Staff in Moscow.
The United States had about 5,000 warheads, the Soviet Union 300, and of those only 2 or 3 dozen that could hit the United States. Unfortunately for Khrushchev, the Soviet Union was surrounded by military bases, American bases. But America was free of that encirclement.
But for Khrushchev, there is a bright spot: Fidel Castro's Cuba. A communist island in a sea of American power, Khrushchev's one small foothold in the Western Hemisphere. But Cuba was an ally that could be lost at any moment. The U.S. had been trying to overthrow Castro since 1961, first by small infiltrations, then, finally, in an invasion by Cuban exiles, trained, armed, and sponsored by the CIA. That mission at the Bay of Pigs failed badly.
The Bay of Pigs invasion of 1960 was the culmination of activities of the United States against the Cuban Revolution.
After Bay of Pigs invasion and its collapse, Moscow got a proof that there are real intervention plans supported, at least supported, by Washington.
Khrushchev's solution? Do with Cuba what the U.S. had done in Turkey. Put nuclear weapons right under the enemy's nose. The Soviet strategic position would improve practically overnight. With one bold stroke, Castro's Cuba would be protected from impending invasion, while Khrushchev's bargaining power and his prestige would be enhanced. At the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, General Gripkov takes a lead role in planning the top-secret operation.
There were no telephone conversations, no letters written, not even codes, nothing.
The operation is codenamed Anadyr. It's the name of a cold Siberian city, a clever diversion from their actual tropical destination.
And it was decided to send a mission to Cuba to discuss this idea with Cubans.
Fidel didn't give us an immediate answer. He said, we need time to think.
When the offer to deploy these missiles was presented by the Soviets in May of 1962, Cuba felt obliged to accept the missiles in order to show solidarity towards socialist countries that were supporting Cuba in this very unequal battle against the U.S. administration.
On the third day, Fidel said, if it is necessary for the interests of the world revolution and the interests of the Soviet Union, then we agree.
With Castro's consent, Operation Anadyr is on. It would be the largest seaborne operation in Soviet history. The Soviets have just 4 months to organize, transport, and install 60 nuclear missiles and 40,000 men on an island nearly 8,000 miles away. And it all has to be done in secret. To disguise their intentions, the Soviets decide to use cargo ships. At Soviet ports, 85 ships are prepared for departure. Together, they will transport 60 ballistic missiles, jet aircraft, and more than 40,000 men to an unknown destination. As part of the deception plan, some soldiers are issued Arctic clothing. Even the ship captains have no idea where they are headed.
Before we sailed, we were given 3 sealed packets numbered 1, 2, and 3. On the first was written, to be opened after leaving the territorial waters of the Soviet Union.
As the ships pass through the Bosphorus Straits in Turkey, the second envelope is opened. It contains the order to steam beyond the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic Ocean.
In the third packet was the order to go on to Havana, Cuba, and everything became clear.
Clear, but not easy. Temperatures below decks reach 110 to 115 degrees.
The situation was very difficult. There was not enough water. There were no bathrooms. We had to use buckets. But the worst part was the heat. We were almost dying from the heat and the stuffiness, but it was forbidden for us to go out on deck. There was a guard. They only opened the hatch at night, so men could go out on deck and get fresh air.
As the ships approach Caribbean waters, they are closely observed by American aircraft. The Americans have reason to be suspicious. Throughout 1961 and 62, the United States military has been developing contingency plans for a full-scale U.S. invasion of Cuba. Its codename, Opland 316. Flying as low as 200 feet, American Navy aircraft photographed the ship's mysterious cargo.
When we were 2 or 3 days from Cuba, we noticed the American reconnaissance aircraft above us. On the last day of our trip, an American helicopter was hovering above us, almost touching our mast.
The photographs from the Navy patrols are rushed to Washington, D.C. The film is received by an elite team of photo analysts at the secretive National Photographic Interpretation Center, or NPIC. Dino Brugioni was a lead analyst on the NPIC team.
During 1962, there was just one ship after another carrying supplies to Cuba, and we were looking at each one of them. When the Russian freighters came out of the Bosphorus, they were photographed in the Bosphorus. They were photographed again from our units in Sicily and Gibraltar. So we had all this photography coming in.
While Brugione and his colleagues cannot see the ship's cargo, they can make conclusions based on what is visible. The photographs show crates on the decks of the ships.
We had a good knowledge of the crates that the Soviets packed their aircraft in because we had been watching Egypt and Syria and others who were receiving Soviet aid. We could precisely measure the crate. In a sense, we would make like a little box and then see what would fit in them.
The Soviet ships unload at the port of Mariel in Cuba. U.S. surveillance photographs confirm the contents of the crates. Fighter jets, patrol boats, and trucks, all clearly arms for Cuba. But there is no photographic evidence of nuclear missiles. For the Soviets, their secret is safe. Leading one team of missile engineers is a young major, Mikhail Bernov.
We would unload at Mariel only at night. We had the missiles in the big hangar, and we would only transport them after 3 in the morning.
Moving at night keeps the missiles secret from the watchful eyes of American surveillance. Keeping the operation secret from Cuban civilians, however, proves a greater challenge. Jorge Risquet was a party secretary in the Cuban government.
We have to say that it was an open secret. A secret that millions of Cubans knew about. For example, there were cases where we would have to tear down a house in a small village to allow the big missile trucks to turn a corner.
It was difficult to maneuver a 30-meter-long missile on a truck. It's hard to corner in small villages where there may be a 90-degree turn with a telephone pole. We would have to cut down the pole to get through.
The Soviet soldiers wear civilian clothing and are not allowed to speak Russian. Once troops arrive at the designated sites, the living conditions remain difficult.
We didn't have housing. We had to build it ourselves. We didn't want to go to bed. We were scared of insects biting us.
Meanwhile, 75,000 feet above them, they are being watched. The American U-2 is a high-altitude spy plane, carrying cameras loaded with high-resolution film. It shoots enormous negatives of the ground from 14 miles high. The U-2 can see fine detail, small vehicles, men, tire tracks. But August 1962 is cloudy. For 3 crucial weeks, the U-2 overflights are put on hold. the assembly and concealment of the Soviet missile sites continues to go unobserved. August 29th, a U-2 spy plane is finally cleared for an overflight of Cuba. When the film from this run is analyzed by the NPIC, they discover the first signs of real trouble.
On an August the 28th mission over Cuba, we spot these objects. This particular pattern looks like a Star of David.
The photo analysts recognize this pattern from previous reconnaissance photography of Soviet weapon sites. There is no doubt these objects are what's known as SAMs, SA-2 surface-to-air missile sites. Problem number one, SA-2 SAMs are capable of shooting down U-2 aircraft. Problem number two, the fact that the Soviets installed these sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons indicates they are protecting something much larger. But for now, the nuclear missiles are too well hidden to be seen.
The missiles were covered in tents. They were 30 meters long, put into a ditch and covered so that from above you could only see tents.
As Major Richard Heiser takes off from Edwards Air Force Base in California on the next U-2 overflight of Cuba, the U.S.-Soviet situation stands at a crossroads. The Soviets are within days of making their nuclear missiles operational. The Americans know something dangerous is happening in Cuba, but aren't sure what it is. On Vieques Island, off the coast of Puerto Rico, Opland 316 is rehearsed by American Marines in preparation for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. 7 a.m. As Heiser steers his U-2 into Cuban airspace, the Cold War is about to change dramatically. Major Richard Heiser returns from a 6-hour flight over Cuba and lands his U-2 spy plane at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida. The film is rushed to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska and to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington for analysis. Airman Michael Davis was a 23-year-old photo analyst stationed at Offutt.
I walked into BB-12, which is where we briefed all the generals all the time. Major Olson was in there. He says, "There's your table." He says, "And here's the film. Let's get started." About 1 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "Where's the circle?" So we pulled down the screen, and then the SAM circle appeared. I said, "Let's look in the center. We got something."
After hours of scrutinizing the film, Davis comes across a series of long cylindrical shapes that look strangely familiar. At the NPIC in Washington later that morning, Dino Brugioni and the NPIC staff are coming to the same conclusion.
We're seeing 8 objects 65 feet long. We're seeing 2 objects that are 100 feet long. And these are alien to that environment.
Brugioni and Davis have each made a find with grave implications. The measurements of the objects match perfectly with Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles. Missiles that have nuclear warheads.
And we were convinced that this was what we had was a field-deployed SS-4 site.
The Soviet SS-4 missile has a range of 2,000 miles. When launched from San Cristobal, Cuba, it can hit Washington, D.C., Baltimore, the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska, and the entire southeastern United States. As the men at NPIC look at the U-2 photos, they find another SS-4 site, then another. They work through the night until NPIC Chief Art Lundahl comes in the next morning.
Lundahl came in the morning, and he looked at them, and he kind of sighed. He said, "This is trouble. This is real trouble."
NPIC Chief Art Lundahl goes to the White House to brief President Kennedy and his National Security Council on the grim discovery. That meeting, like many others during the coming crisis, is secretly recorded by President Kennedy and only recently declassified. In the room with President Kennedy are Marshall Carter of the CIA, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and other top aides. The group became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM.
This is a result of the photography taken Sunday, sir. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and two new military encampments on the southern edge of the Sierra de Rosario, in west-central Cuba. Where would that be? West-central, sir, right? The launch site in one of the encampments contains a total of at least 14 canvas-covered missile trailers measuring 67 feet in length.
How do you know this is a medium-range ballistic missile?
The lens, sir.
The Soviets have made a bold move. The discussion turns toward a quick solution: airstrikes to destroy the ballistic missile sites before they become operational.
I think it's extremely important.
Defense Secretary McNamara.
Discussion be founded on this premise that any airstrike will be planned to take place prior to the time they become operational. Because if they become operational before the airstrike, I do not believe we can state we can knock them out before they can be launched. And if they're launched, there is almost certain to be chaos in part of the East Coast or the area in a radius of 600 to 1,000 miles from Cuba.
What no one in Washington knows is that at least one ballistic missile site in Cuba is about to become operational.
But by the time President Kennedy received that report, at that moment our missiles were already in place, and we were ready.
In Washington, President Kennedy goes over his military options.
How long does it take to get in position to invade Cuba? Almost a month or 2 months? No, sir. It's a matter of 7 days after the airstrike, assuming the airstrike starts the first next week. You get 6 divisions or 7 divisions in Cuba in 7 days?
No, sir. There are two plans we have. One is to go at maximum speed, which is the one referred to by Secretary McNamara, about 7 days after the strike. We put in 90,000 men in 11 days. If you have time, if you give us more time so we get all the advanced preparation and pre-positioning, we put the same 90,000 in the basket.
A naval blockade of Cuba to keep out further Soviet weapons is another option. But the military wants an invasion. Kennedy needs time to decide. He orders an increase in U-2 surveillance flights. What no one in EXCOM knows is that the Soviets in Cuba are also armed with battlefield nuclear weapons. Short-range missiles with the ability to decimate an invading army. American troops could face these weapons as they land on Cuban beaches. Also unknown is a nuclear threat at sea. Steaming toward the Caribbean at top speed are 4 heavily armed Soviet submarines. Nikolai Shumkov was captain of one of them.
Our submarine was armed with 22 torpedoes, one of which was a nuclear torpedo.
3 American Navy aircraft carriers patrol the Caribbean, unaware of the approaching submarine threat.
As far as I'm concerned, having received an order to use my nuclear torpedo, I would surely have aimed it at an aircraft carrier, and there were plenty of them there in the area.
But the greatest nuclear threat to the United States is about to be discovered. At NPIC in Washington, Dino Brucioni's team analyzes the latest U-2 film.
The missions had been flown on the 16th and 17th, and we find these which were referred to as slash marks. And we immediately recognized that these were IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missile, capable of being fired from Cuba and going 2,200 miles. I had taken a map and I'd scribed an arc, and it would cover all of the United States except the extreme northwest.
At EXCOM, it quickly becomes apparent that the Soviet response to a U.S. invasion of Cuba could mean the destruction of nearly the entire continental United States. The next day, President Kennedy meets with Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko to discuss the nature of arms shipments to Cuba. Gromyko denies that there are any offensive weapons in Cuba. Kennedy can prove otherwise, but resists the temptation to confront Gromyko with the photographic evidence. If he decides to take military action against the missile sites or invade the island, he will need the element of surprise. The next morning, October 19th, President Kennedy meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The senior U.S. military commanders favor airstrikes followed by invasion. Kennedy disagrees. He thinks the Soviets will retaliate by taking Berlin. With the Joint Chiefs angry, the Soviets in denial, and Berlin heavy on his mind, President Kennedy nevertheless keeps up appearances by going on a political trip to the Midwest. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the first missile site in Cuba is now operational and can launch on 5 hours' notice.
One regiment was made combat ready on the 20th. Because of equipment delays, our regiment was not ready until the 25th.
In the Caribbean, the tension in the Soviet submarines is fed by an eerie radio silence.
Radio communication stopped. There was complete radio silence. There was no radio communication whatsoever, and that seemed odd to us. We guessed that there was an abnormal situation, but we didn't know what it was.
Shumkov is not in touch with his commanders, but the U.S. Navy is in touch with Shumkov.
We were being hunted by an anti-submarine aircraft. The carrier Essex was blocking us. Its mission was not to let us pass through the defenses. It was a problem without a solution.
In Washington, with the president absent, ExComm reaches consensus. Since a blockade has overtones of the infamous 1948 Soviet blockade of Berlin, Secretary of State Dean Rusk coins the term quarantine. Plans for airstrikes followed by an invasion of Cuba continue to be drawn up. In the meantime, quarantine is a go. Attorney General Robert Kennedy calls the president and suggests he return from Chicago to listen to the ExComm proposals. Pleading a cold, President Kennedy leaves Chicago. Oplan 316 for the invasion of Cuba has been underway for 10 months. But it now has a new immediacy. The timetable is for Marines to land in Cuba just 8 days after air attacks start. Oplan 316 involves 500,000 men, including 40,000 Marines, almost 15,000 paratroopers, 1,000 aircraft, and 180 ships. Elements of the 1st Marine Division leave Camp Pendleton, California, for a voyage through the Panama Canal and into the Caribbean. Tom Brooks was a naval intelligence officer with the task force.
Leaving San Diego was one of great enthusiasm, anxious to go get them. We're going to throw the Soviets out of there and, teach them this is our hemisphere, and we're going to do away with Castro once and for all.
As President Kennedy returns to the White House, he has no idea how many Soviets are in Cuba, and no idea that his troops may be heading toward a nuclear battlefield. On this same day, the CIA notices that at least one of the Soviet ballistic missile regiments in Cuba is ready to fire at any time. Kennedy had wanted any airstrikes to happen before the missiles were ready to fire. That window has now closed. The invasion calls for landings on the northeast and northwest coasts of Cuba, plus a breakout of Marines from Guantanamo Bay to attack what was thought to be 8,000 Soviet soldiers, fighting alongside the Cuban army. But the Soviet troops awaiting them in Cuba are far more numerous than the Americans ever estimated.
There was a great reluctance to believe that there were organized combat units in Cuba, and a reluctance to believe that they would actually engage U.S. forces.
Worse, Oplan 316 does not envision Soviet tactical nuclear weapons.
I hesitate to think even what that would have led to. We were not prepared at all for nuclear combat.
October 22nd, U.S. Navy ships are ordered to enforce a blockade of Cuba. setting the stage for a showdown with the Soviet convoy. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara orders U.S. families and dependents evacuated from Guantanamo Bay and dispatches Marines to reinforce the base. In Havana, Fidel Castro is also preparing for the worst.
At noon on the 22nd, it was announced that Kennedy would be addressing the nation that night. And we knew as soon as we heard that it would concern Cuba because they have discovered the missiles. At 3:50 p.m., the armed forces were put on alert. At 5:45, the combat alarm was sounded, which means the men were in the trenches with weapons in their hands.
The United States military is on high alert, and the world braces for Kennedy's speech. At 7 p.m. on October 22nd, President Kennedy addresses the American public.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Kennedy's speech echoes throughout the world. The seriousness of the crisis is now exposed. U.S. Strategic Air Command places the armed forces to a higher defense condition. DEFCON 3.
When Kennedy announced that the missiles were deployed in Cuba, it was a very serious situation, and war was something that could happen at any moment.
We heard President Kennedy on the radio telling the American people that we were on the verge of thermonuclear war. About 10 divisions were gathering in Florida for the invasion of Cuba. We received orders from headquarters for a 4-hour readiness for the use of our nuclear-tipped torpedo. Khrushchev believed that if anyone should stop our convoys, then our submarines should sink them, while I considered this to be a risky approach.
U-2 photographs have convinced the experts in Washington that there are Soviet missiles in Cuba. But to make a conclusive case to the rest of the world, detailed close-up photographs are needed. The responsibility for capturing those photographs would fall on Navy Commander William Ecker of Light Photographic Squadron 62.
After I took off, there was a strong west wind, and I was flying just a compass course, and I happened to, about after 10 or 11 minutes, I looked up, and there at 11 o'clock was the Havana skyline, and I thought, oh boy, they're gonna know we're coming. So I just turned a little more to the right, headed out to Mariel, and then turned south for about 2 minutes, and I looked down, and there they were.
On the 22nd, they were flying at altitudes as low as 100 meters over us. We could even see the pilot in his helmet.
I saw the missiles, and they were covered with a camouflage netting, but I could see that they had missile launchers and so forth down there, or trailers, and all kinds of equipment. So I'm there, 1, 2, 3 seconds, and depart.
Although risky, Ecker's high-speed mission is a success, and the photographs he took left no doubt what was there.
We see the missile-ready tent. We see 5 missiles. We see fueling and checkout vehicles, and even if you look close, you can see men walking around. Now, this photograph is taken at 250 feet, about the speed of sound. And this is the kind of thing, now when we're showing this to policymakers, this is what they really understand.
With Soviet denial still fresh, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson arrives in New York for a Security Council session, armed with a surprise. Leading the meeting is Soviet Ambassador Zorin. Stevenson interrupts.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Stevenson doesn't wait. Instead, he launches into a presentation that would stun the world, and especially William Ecker.
He reached behind him, there was an easel there, and he flipped the shroud on it off, and there were the pictures, right at the UN.
At the cost of revealing secret surveillance capabilities, Ecker's photographs make the U.S. case undeniable. With American ships in place, the quarantine goes into effect. 2 Soviet ships, the Yuri Gagarin and the Kimovsk, steam toward the blockade line. Between them, one of the Soviet submarines carrying a nuclear torpedo. In the White House, Defense Secretary McNamara narrates the situation to the president.
There is a submarine very close, we believe, to each of them. The submarine will be at the barrier tonight, late today, and hence it's a very dangerous situation. The Navy recognizes this, is fully prepared to meet it.
The war might have started this way. The American ships attacked the Soviet submarine and somehow harm it. In that case, the commander would definitely have to use his weapons.
President Kennedy is reluctant to start the war here.
Get the surface or take some action. We wish this the merchant ship, but we just don't attack them anyway. At what point are we going to attack it? I think we got to wait on that today. We don't want to have the first thing we attack is the Soviet submarine.
It was almost a fatal tragedy for us. During this cat-and-mouse play with the Americans, we almost completely spent our battery. My engineer said to me, "Our battery is almost dead. We can't remain underwater. We can either surface or sink." I decided to surface. It was daylight. When I came up, I saw strange ships, American ships.
Robert Kennedy would later say that this moment is the one that brought the world closest to nuclear war. And it is now that the U.S. Strategic Air Command moves to Defense Condition, or DEFCON 2. Nearly 60 Strategic Air Command aircraft loaded with nuclear weapons are airborne around the clock. Bombers on the ground are loaded with nuclear weapons, given targets, and placed on a 15-minute alert.
I thought, if there was a war, an invasion of Cuba, there would be nuclear war, and that would result in the disappearance of millions and millions of people.
On October 26th, word comes to the White House that inbound Soviet ships have stopped.
Now, what did they say they're doing with those, John? Well, they either stop them or reverse direction.
I suddenly received a message from headquarters ordering me to leave my position and retreat about 100 miles and take a stationary position.
The Soviets, it seems, have blinked. For now, at least, the first shots of war will not take place at sea. But on land and in the air, the threat of nuclear war is greater than it has ever been. During the 25th and 26th of October, the Strategic Air Command remains at DEFCON 2. In the event of war, the Strategic Air Command has but one nuclear scenario: total nuclear commitment, known as the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. It envisions sending every American nuclear missile, aircraft, and submarine to launch against not only the Soviet Union, but the entire communist world. While launch authority rests only with Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy, many types of nuclear weapons on both sides can be released without that authority. The detonation of a single nuclear weapon could quickly escalate into global nuclear devastation.
So it was extremely dangerous situation. We were at a stage when that could have happened without the direct will of Khrushchev and Kennedy. It could happen as a result of nervous breakdown of rank and file people.
The blockade may have stopped the incoming Soviet ships, but 134 nuclear warheads have already landed. All 3 of the SS-4 missile regiments are now operational. Engineers like Mikhail Bernov receive orders from Moscow to increase launch readiness to just 2.5 hours. The nuclear warheads for the missiles are brought closer to the launch sites.
Our storage area for nuclear warheads was 50-60 kilometers away from us, so the actual combat readiness could be achieved in no less time than 5.5 hours in all. The readiness was 2 hours and 30 minutes once everything was in place there.
But the Soviets still do not act to prevent U.S. overflights. Cuban forces, however, are becoming more agitated by the continuous violation of Cuban airspace.
If you have an anti-aircraft battery in place, the idea is to use them. But really, there was no decision on the part of the Soviets to start shooting against the U-2. Remember that the Soviets were the ones who were manning the SAM-2, the anti-aircraft missiles.
In defiance of Soviet complacency, Cuban anti-aircraft guns fire on U.S. reconnaissance planes. With the crisis escalating, new hope of a diplomatic solution comes from an unlikely source. ABC reporter John Scully meets with a Soviet diplomat known as Alexander Fomin at the Occidental Restaurant in Washington, D.C., a block from the White House. His real name is Alexander Feklisov.
My position as a counselor was that of a cover, because I was an intelligence officer, and moreover, I was the resident of the Russian intelligence group in Washington at that time.
Scully had talked with State Department officials and had been briefed on how to handle the conversation.
Coffee was served, and without any overtures he said, on the authority of the highest American authority, I am proposing these terms of the Cuban crisis solution. First, the Soviet Union takes its missiles from Cuba and the U.S. removes its blockade. Second, the President gives a public pledge of non-aggression against Cuba. I said, there's a question, what do you mean by highest authority of the United States? And he said it letter by letter.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President of the United States.
In Moscow, Khrushchev composes a personal and emotional letter to Kennedy, appealing for an end to the crisis. He offers to remove the missiles in return for Kennedy's promise to end the quarantine and not invade Cuba. When the letter is finally received, decoded, and translated, it is after 9 p.m. on the 26th. 12 hours later at 9 a.m. on the 27th, ExComm reconvenes in the White House. While members are discussing the conciliatory Khrushchev letter, President Kennedy is handed a news bulletin and reads it aloud.
Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy yesterday to withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey. He did. Well, it's read by both of the associations. Put it out so far. Reuters said the same thing. He did? He didn't really say that, did he? He may not be putting out another paper.
ExComm thinks that Khrushchev, or some new hardline element in Moscow, is adding further demands. The removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey.
You know, to get those two different messages in close proximity, the question that was raised in the minds of not only myself, but a lot of other people, who's in charge in the Soviet Union? You know, and that's when things really get dangerous. You know, if there is some uncertainty about who's in command and who's giving the orders on the other side, that's when you know you're really in danger.
The danger is becoming very real, and for one man, it will be fatal. Ever since the Soviet missiles were first discovered, the U.S. Air Force has been flying periodic spy missions over Cuba. So far, the Soviets have hesitated to fire. 9 a.m. Major Rudolph Anderson takes off from McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, for his overflight of Cuba. At 10 a.m. local time, he guides his U-2 over the Cuban port of Baines. Against standing orders from Moscow, the Soviet commander on the ground decides to fire. The missile streaks 75,000 feet into the sky and bursts next to Anderson's aircraft, killing him and sending the U-2 spinning down to Earth. The Cuban Missile Crisis now has its first combat fatality. Word of the shoot-down doesn't reach the president until a 4 p.m. meeting with ExCom.
U-2 was shot down. Low altitude surveillance. Shot down? Yes, Roger said it was not shot down. Pilot killed? Well, this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
A U.S. pilot has been killed, and the military want a response. Airstrikes preceding the invasion of Cuba are set to start tomorrow, unless Kennedy and Khrushchev can find a way out. In Washington, the president decides to send Bobby Kennedy to meet with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and make an offer. The Soviets would dismantle and immediately remove their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would end the quarantine and promise not to invade Cuba. But the Kennedys secretly offer one more, very substantial incentive. The U.S. would also remove NATO Jupiter missiles from Turkey. But only if that concession were kept utterly secret by the Soviets. Kennedy gives the Soviets 24 hours to respond. With U.S. attacks on Cuba just hours away, the nuclear battlefield is as close as it has ever been. For those in the know, both in Washington and Moscow, fear has reached a fever pitch.
I told my wife, I will not go to work today. I don't know what will be tomorrow. It's quite possible that tomorrow we will not be alive. Let's go to the cinema to see a new film.
The Secret Service wanted to take the president to the underground. Well, I had been to the underground and I was cleared for it. That night was one of the most miserable that I've ever spent because I kept thinking of what could happen and, you know, that I would be in a safe place and my family would be incinerated because I was convinced that Washington would be a target.
The whole of mankind was on the brink, on the verge of a nuclear abyss. We were 2 hours away from the end. 2 hours.
October 28th, 3 a.m. Moscow. The Soviets have an announcement to make, a personal message from Khrushchev to President Kennedy. This time, they use Radio Moscow rather than a Western Union telegram. Khrushchev announces that the missile sites will be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. Is the crisis finally over? President Kennedy puts off military action for 1 day while he waits for that day's reconnaissance photography to be examined.
The planes are out, and when we look at the photography, now they're pulling back. You could see that they'd pulled the missiles back, they had pulled the launchers out. It was obvious now that they had gotten the word.
Over the following months, 60 ballistic missiles and 134 nuclear warheads are dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. Although serious tensions remain, one of the most perilous chapters of the 20th century is over.
The United States has not been at DEFCON 2 since the Cuban Missile Crisis. After spending a few weeks at the brink of nuclear war, both the Americans and the Soviets took steps to make certain that superpower confrontation was never conducted in the dark, and that the other side always had a way out. Thank heaven for second chances. The Cuban Missile Crisis almost left us without one. I'm Tom Clancy. Thanks for watching.